Public health is a population-based field of science focused on preventing disease and promoting health. Every week, we will be engaging in interactive discussions and analyses of the latest public health issues affecting you and your communities all around the world. This is the Public Health Insight Podcast.
Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent any of the organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
Ben, Gordon, Sully, and Will are joined by Linda, Rose, and T. Natalie in part 2 of our 2-part State of the Union Roundtable Series, co-hosted by the Focused Health Collective and Public Health Insight. In this episode, we will continue our discussions from the previous episode, part 1, about exposing all forms of racism, prejudice, and discrimination in society. In particular, we talk about moving beyond initial discomfort for a more open dialogue on the topic of racism to the need to sustain the momentum generated by societal outrage to achieve long-term meaningful change. We will also share some powerful TV shows and movies that can serve as good educational tools about the subject of anti-Black racism in the context of the United States. It's like people are trying to change the narrative and change the conversation to whatever suits them and like take away from what we all should actually focus on. And to just try to change the conversation.
Bro, I'm gonna pop off, especially cause, like.
Go ahead,
like, man. Like what pisses me off.
I want you to pop off. Let's go.
Like what pisses me off is it's like the whole, it's like the whole all lives matter thing. Oh my god!
Oh my god!
Like everyone who's been kind of just perpetuating that message has completely missed the mark and not understood like what the Black Lives Matter is supposed to be trying to. I guess get at.
Right.
I think it's important to highlight though that it speaks to just a larger issue of if you're used to having your experiences, seeing yourself centered all the time, to hear another narrative that does not center your lived experience is jarring, it's shocking, it's uncomfortable, you're going to be defensive. And for many people who are not racialized or are not part of a minority, the issue of racism is dead. It's like racism is owning slaves. We don't do that anymore, so it doesn't exist. It's not in their reality. So like when these issues come up and people are sharing their lived experiences, so many people want to just like clap back and say, no, racism doesn't exist. I'm not racist. That's not my lived experience. And so like, I think that's why we see, well, no, all lives matter, because to say Black Lives Matter is a threat. It changes the narrative. It doesn't center the dominant narrative. And so it's really easy to get riled up. And I think anger is a positive. Like it's an emotion. Feel the anger, but also to remember that I think it's also a human problem. Like if you're used to having that power and that privilege, you don't just easily give it up. And so that's why we will talk about kneeling to protest police brutality or to protest Black people being killed, and it flips to actually this is offensive to me because of the flag. Meanwhile, that was not the conversation to begin with. Right. And I don't know how to, I guess, have conversations where you can meet eye to eye, but often it feels like we're talking about completely different issues.
Yeah, I think also too with the Drew Brees situation, part of what he said struck me because it goes to a bigger conversation when I try to talk with like my white friends or white colleagues. But that idea with him saying, what he thought the kneeling was about, for him to say that if he had said the opposite, if you open that can of worms, I'm thinking about Drew Brees, like that is forcing you to look at or just to really examine the foundations of your own belief systems. And I think that's a harder discussion to have. I think it's easier to just say, oh, it's not a big deal, let's move on. But to really have those dialogues about race and history and, priding yourself in being a military family, that's great, but your experience looks completely different for someone else. I think it's a challenge, and I think that makes it difficult for us Black people, white people, to have real conversations because it challenges you, both sides, to a certain extent. I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and I was saying, I think part of the issue here is just, can we have dialogue? Like, if I'm talking to you about race, does not mean that I'm calling you a racist, right? That's not what I'm saying, but can we acknowledge our history? Can we acknowledge our differences? And the very few white ally friends that I have, we've been able to have those tough conversations where it's not a blame game, where they've shared their own, family history growing up in the South, and they've openly shared that with me. And I think it's okay to talk about these things, because I would assume that if, you are an adult and your family is from Georgia and you're white, there is most likely some racism going on back there somewhere, right? So let's acknowledge it. Let's put it out there. Let's talk about how, that may or may not have impacted you. And I can appreciate my friends who've been able to, and not just recently, but have always been able to engage in those types of conversations. But I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge because when you start talking about race, I think it goes straight to defense mode. Like, oh, no, let's not do that. And I think maybe that's where Drew Brees was maybe trying to tiptoe that line, which is its own issue. You play football, you have black teammates. I was just like, wow.
Right. Also, one of the arguments that is used, that it's almost like a medal of honor that, some white people will use, is they'll say, I don't see color, thinking that.
Oh my God!
And the idea is that they think that it will make them good because they can see you for who you are. But if you don't see that I'm black, you don't know that I get discriminated against when I go to work, when I go to school, when I go to, to some government agency to fill out some documents. You don't know that I'm experiencing racism if you just see me as a normal person. So to see me as just me means that you don't understand that the system is essentially rigged so that I fail and you succeed. And that is problematic as well.
Because who wants to see that, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable.
So I had something in a similar situation where I live and where I've grown up, a majority of my life is predominantly white compared to my younger youth or whatever. Grew up in the GTA area, pretty diverse. And then I had moved and I had childhood friends, and it was one of those things, I don't see color. Her parents, there wasn't ever really a discussion or dialogue about different races. And I understand the intent behind it, that it's like, okay, we want to see people as people, and we'd be friends for a while. And it wasn't until we had reached young adulthood, I had taken her back to the GTA to meet my family. And when we had gotten back home, she had said that she finally sees what Black people see on a regular basis, because in this situation, she was the minority.
I think one thing that this whole experience that I've reflected upon is that with the issue of racism and everything like that, like what kind of Rose mentioned earlier about having those discussions, what I really hope, at least a portion of what comes out of what's going on right now, is that individuals can use this as an opportunity to do some self-reflection and recognize their own biases. Because I think for myself, even just over the last week with what's going on in the news, I think I've taken the opportunity at least to look inward and recognize that, I've had racist thoughts. I've had, I've had prejudices and just discriminated and stuff like that. And I think it's obviously those things are wrong and are bad, but I think it's part of that bridging process where, in order to make change, in order to see change and hopefully have a future where we can, achieve equity, I think individuals need to recognize that and see it as something that is wrong and actually make an effort to address it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Will. I think the important thing to note here is racism is some kind of implicit or explicit bias someone can have, okay? When you have a bias about something that's not necessarily race, that's still a bias. So race is simply just a bias that you have that has something to do with the color of someone's skin. So everyone experiences bias about gender. Oh, women aren't as good as drivers, blah, 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 blah. Everyone has had some kind of thought that or stereotype of a group of people based on no evidence, okay? Racism, all racism is that you do the same concept, but then you just judge someone for the color of their skin. So I think what Will's trying to say is everyone should own everything. It's not about pointing fingers about, I've never had a racist thought, so I'm better than you. You need to be fired.
Yeah.
No. That's not what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
People who have actively discriminated and harmed people need to be held accountable. But we have to understand that if we do put a policy in place, you can't discriminate against, what you're trying to say is police who still might feel that they're superior to black people are no longer going to be given a free pass for killing them. That does not solve the issue of implicit racism and bias. So I just want to make that clear.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to posit a question to the group in the sense of when we said I don't see color and there's a lot of talk about acknowledgement, I wanted to see what your guys' take was on tokenism in the sense of when you try to bring up white privilege to individuals who don't believe in it, their argument for it is, well, look at Obama and Oprah and all these other successful black people. They were able to make it. Do you think that they were successful because they put themselves in these moments where they thought about racism? And I understand that this is very much buying into the whole merit-based achievement ideologies of the American dream, and it ignores existing political and structural barriers that people of color face. And I was just wondering what your experiences have been or what hot takes you have on that.
I'll add to it before I pass it on, Ben. I think another element to that discussion is what I also hear is, oh, I'm a poor white person and I'm not complaining as much as you. But what you have to understand is you are not in that position because of the color of your skin. So that's a very important thing that always comes back. There's white people living in poverty. There's black people living in poverty. Keep in mind, black people face different social factors that put them in a position that they are now. White people also face social factors that put them in a position where they are, but racism is not one of them. So racism is there's constants such as income, equality, education, but the narrative is being shifted to racism as a public health issue because racism in of itself, like you're saying, Will, is a social determinant of health. Wealthy black people still experience discrimination, despite the fact that maybe they're healthy, they have a great education, they have a lot of money, and they still experience some negative health outcomes. So it just shows that racism in of itself, as much as it might be an invisible thing that you can't really put your hand on it does affect people's emotional and well-being.
I think when people bring up, Obama or Oprah, it's in an attempt to kind of dismiss that there are systems that work to favor certain races over another. And it's like, well, if one person did it, why couldn't you? But everybody has experiences of privilege or oppression in terms of it could be class privilege or, you have more education, so that affords you more opportunities. I think everybody can understand that concept. But when you bring it back to, okay, but the color of your skin also dictates certain types of experiences or access issues that you can experience, for some reason that becomes so controversial. And so I don't know. I don't really understand why people think that, throwing in Obama or Oprah negates the lived experiences of everybody else who's been saying this is their lived experience. But maybe it just goes back to not wanting to feel uncomfortable and not wanting to acknowledge that there's a problem.
Yeah, that's a great point, Linda, because I've been watching a lot of videos, and again, because I identify as black, it doesn't mean I'm an expert on black issues. Just like everyone else, I too have to go back and I wasn't around in the 60s. I wasn't around in the 1920s. I have to go back and also educate myself. And one of the things I've been finding is that to challenge someone on racism and they're getting from denial to acceptance mirrors the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that's what you're saying, Linda. It's almost like when I bring this issue to you, okay, racism is an issue, there's always denial. Then there's anger, that you are maybe taking the power away. Then there's bargaining in the sense of, okay, let's throw these people a bone and maybe they'll go away. And then when you break through all those barriers, finally you can get to a point of acceptance where they don't necessarily agree with the privilege and power that is being lost, but they're kind of resigned to the fact that the overwhelming majority of people is saying that this is the right thing to do. Okay, so this has been a sensitive, topic. In as much as we're all hurt, and despite our race or ethnicity, we must be the change that we want to see. So I want to emphasize that. So let's talk about some of the first steps that need to happen before any kind of long-term sustained change is achieved. And maybe we'll start with, what are some of the outcomes that each of you would like to see from this? It could be short-term outcomes or long-term outcomes.
I personally would like to see healing happen. Collectively, as a Black community, there's been a lot of trauma. Racism is a trauma, and it's something that we don't often speak of. Perhaps maybe in our most intimate relationships we will, but you don't necessarily share it because it feels uncomfortable. It's shameful. It makes you feel less than. And so lately, when all of this has surfaced, I've seen people sharing their experiences, and not to force anyone to share, but I think feeling safety or feeling that freedom to share can promote healing, and we can lean on each other. It's like you're not the only one who's gone through this. You have a community to support you.
And that's an important point, Linda, because one of my issues with this whole thing is when it wasn't status quo to support Black people telling their stories about racism, they didn't receive as much support. Their friends weren't there to back them. The companies weren't there to back them. Organizations, governments weren't there to back them. But now it's kind of in vogue to be pro-Black. So now everyone feels comfortable to come out and we condemn racism and and all this stuff. And one of the posts I've been sharing a lot more and being more vulnerable. And one of the things I've been stressing is when this hashtag goes to the 1,000th most popular hashtag by the end of the year, this level of momentum needs to stay the same. The status quo needs to move from, racism, whatever, to it's just condemned, period, outright. No matter if it's November, December, October, whatever the day is, whatever day of the month, whatever month of the year, it's just condemned. And that we need to make this the status quo.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think for me, in the short to midterm range, what I'd like to see is us move from what Gordon said, hashtags, to actual tangible support. Even today I was out in DC. I think it's great to see so many people are out and voicing their opinions and showing support to this cause and to this movement. But I guess the cynic in me is like, okay, what happens in August? Are you going to show up for me? Are you still going to promote Black Lives Matter? How is this going to change how we work together, or we go to church together? How long will this last? And it's unfortunate that my thoughts kind of went there today, but they did, because while I'm sure we have so many allies that exist, is just also poignant to ask, where were you 2 weeks ago? I didn't see you rallying behind the cause. I didn't see you supporting the movement. I think about the NFL putting out the statement yesterday, but just, Colin Kaepernick doesn't have a job, and we know what he went through. So while I'm excited to see corporate entities and even my own company put out a statement against racism, what I like to see is is that shift from this is trendy and this is the cool thing to say, to actually implementing changes, in our systems and moving them forward. I think we can talk about this in circles. I think we can hashtag this to death. But, there's still a part of me that is hopeful, I guess, that this is the beginning of something amazing. That's one thing my girlfriends and I talked about today was, 50 years from now, I hope we can look back and say, this was the start of something, and not just, a hashtag that 6 months from now you can't find on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I'm very optimistic right now is because now we're getting beyond the point of recognizing the problem, which was that's a huge step in and of itself. And now we can begin talking about implementable solutions and, solutions that will be very impactful in the short term, medium term, long term periods of time.
I'm not fairly, I'm a little bit optimistic. Just
I'm really cynical.
I'm 70%
it's a little bit of hope, but I'm also looking at them with a side eye,
Right.
Yeah, it's so what does that statement really mean?
Let's dissect.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a guarded optimism.
Right.
Yeah, well said, yes.
Yeah.
But it's fair to have that guarded optimism because, look at history, right? So, it's fair to say, I hope all this is going to change, but if history shows that it's one step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing, we'll give you a little bit, but we're not going to go all the way. So, I think that's fair. I think a lot of people are feeling like that. What's going to happen when there's a new trending topic or hashtag or whatever? Are we still going to have the same support?
Yeah, it all goes back to if we are able to keep the momentum or not.
That's a great point too, because in November, if nothing gets delayed, there will be an election in the United States. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, right. So, myself and my fellow Black people in North America across the world would be very heartbroken if this gentleman gets back into office. It would be a big FU to a lot of people. It would suggest that people wouldn't say and act as they really should act. They're marching with you in the protest, but then their pen is going to go a different way at the voting booth. There's something when you have hope, and I think that's what everyone is saying. I don't want to go all the way in on hope because I'm going to go to a place if you desert me when I need you at that moment to elect our leaders, and not just the president, all levels of government. If that goes the way it shouldn't go, a lot of people are going to be heartbroken, and there's going to be a lot of pain in that. So I will say that.
Gordon, at the same time, though, I agree to an extent, but at the same time, I've also just seen conversations saying it's not even so much of this particular person in that seat in the White House, but the system that allowed that type of rhetoric to then be said by the person in charge. And so, and maybe this is also my cynical side, but it's sure, change the party, change the leader, but the system is still there, and that is the issue. So
no, I agree. One of my biggest cynical moments is that this movement is great, but I fear that it's just going to make the racists hide in the woodwork again without changing anything.
Or turn it into just a political right-left debate.
Exactly.
Right, because on the opposite end of the spectrum, Ben, when I'll call him DT, was elected, when he was elected, it gave a voice to the racist. They started coming out. It's the opposite end of the spectrum where he gave a platform to a lot of people who had a very cynical belief of the world, racist view, and they came out. So now this movement is giving a voice to people who deserve to be heard, and you almost wonder now, what you said, Ben, they'll go back in hiding and come out again when the time is right, when they think they can win. So I think it has to be a sustained thing. I think it can't be just a protest every week, and former President Obama did talk about the issue, and he said all elements in terms of civil rights are important. It's not that you shouldn't protest or go to your lawmakers. You need to do all these things. So I think there needs to be, and I'm hoping that maybe the youth of today's society will ensure that things will never go back to the way they were, because the way they were, it wasn't good.
I would say that is one thing that does give me hope is seeing the next generation of activists, because they're out here, they're loud, and they're making sure that they're heard. So that gives me some sense of hope. I think about too for here in Maryland. So I live right across the border in Maryland. We just had our election day was this past Tuesday for the primaries, and I think about how many people I know who didn't vote then, and it's worrisome for me thinking about November. But I think someone said it is sustaining the movement, is going beyond just today, but looking at all of the systems that got us here. And dismantling a system isn't going to happen overnight. It's a huge charge. But I think, at least for me personally, I believe in the power of the votes. Even if, you might get someone in power and, hopefully not whatever we have right now. But, it's there's still issues within, our political system. We know that. I just hope November comes around and it's a good day. I think one thing, someone said something that triggered a thought for me, which just kind of took me back to the 2016 election. I think once we got the breakdown of votes, where you kind of looked at the numbers across race, sex, it was really eye-opening for me to see the support that, got him elected. And it was like, wow, okay, so you might be in the fight with me today, as you say, but clearly in the ballot box, you felt something else. So that's where the cynicism still lies for me, even today, seeing all of the Black Lives Matter posters. Because I think about, come election day, who are you really going to vote for? But, it's a little bit of hope, a little bit of hope.
All right, so on a lighter note, so one of the crucial first steps that I think should happen for everybody, unless you're a PhD academic that's been studying this for 50 years, is education. We have to understand, in order to understand what's wrong and how to fix something, we need to know the history of it. So what I've been doing is I've been going through and looking at kind of, educational resources, whether it's in the form of storytelling through TV shows, movies, documentaries, and books. And, when I do get asked questions on, what can I do? My plan is to then say, hey, there's a good TV show on Netflix that can give you some perspective, not to advertise for Netflix, of course, but, just to say, okay, check this out. I'll throw out my 2 suggestions, and if you guys have any books or YouTube series or Netflix series that you're watching, just for the audience, we can throw those out, and for those who want to educate themselves. 2 important things on Netflix. It's not going to cover the full spectrum of the Black experience, of course, but When They See Us and 13th on Netflix by Ava DuVernay, I highly recommend as a starting point in terms of historical systemic racism. That's a good point to start.
I think those are great suggestions. 13th and When They See Us. I personally have not been engaging currently. I just feel that it's a lot of emotional labor and I'm not prepared yet. So,
I wanted to talk about, what's that show that I heard about today with Kerry Washington on Netflix? Is it American Son?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that would be something interesting to watch as well. I know a lot of people, it's about like her and her husband, they have a biracial child. And I guess it's the husband doesn't acknowledge or like realize that his son, although yes, he is half white, he's also half black, and people are going to see him as black. I think that's also something that would be good to watch, because I do know of a lot of people that have biracial children, but it's like it hasn't clicked in yet that these are things that their children will be exposed to.
I'll add the movie Just Mercy.
Oh
to
my
list,
God.
with Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx. Such a brilliant movie. I think for me, also, what I learned from American history was, in textbooks and my own personal research, but the movie really puts you there. And kind of helps you to have a better understanding of the history of race in our judicial system here in the States. And how that legacy and history still lingers, right? And so how it is still built today. So amazing movie. I would definitely recommend that to anyone who's wanting to learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I third that for sure. And for those listening, if you want, we can put out a list of our recommendations, and you can get started and let us know what you think.
Hold on, I just wanted to add, all of those suggestions listed, none of them are feel-good movies or shows to just like eat popcorn. So just be prepared. It will move you. You will probably want to talk it out, and it'll be uncomfortable, but go in recognizing that it will be uncomfortable.
Right.
Oh, I also add, sorry, I just added this book, checked it out from the library, White Fragility. So I'm really curious to see what that's about. Some folks have recommended it on LinkedIn. So I haven't read it yet, so I can't vouch for it, but it's been kind of thrown out there as an interesting read.
And so just to add, like I also highly like to recommend Just Mercy. So I heard recently that the movie has been made free.
That's a good information.
It's the death of George Floyd, as a way to educate people, even just on one aspect of systematic racism. So I think that's it's definitely nice to have a free movie.
Such a good movie.
Yeah.
Oh, and
it's
while we're
hard
on,
to watch, but so good.
Yes, it's there's some tough moments in there, but just like the death of George Floyd, we got to confront reality. While we're on the topic of Michael B. Jordan, Fruitville Station is another. It's not a good watch in terms of, oh my God, I feel good. It's a good depiction of a similar incident where an unarmed African American man was killed. So that's a good watch as well. Thank you for coming on, Rose, Linda, and Tanadli, and joining us at the Public Health Insight for this important discussion. Hopefully, I would love to have more of these again, but not under these same circumstances, just to make that clear.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you so much for having
Thank you.
us.
We must ensure that this outrage generated by George Floyd's death and many more before him is channeled appropriately to get justice for everyone who has been murdered by the choking grip and heavy knees of long-standing systemic racism, prejudices, and discrimination. The momentum should continue all the way to the voting booths, where people should exercise the rights afforded to those living in a democracy. Society has awakened to a roar, and it appears, at least for now, that there is hope. It will not be acceptable to ever go back to normal, because normal is what got us into trouble in the first place. Thanks for listening. Remember, public health is a field of inquiry and an arena for action to improve lives one population at a time. This has been the Public Health Insight Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please drop us a like and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or your podcast platform of choice. You can also send us your questions, comments, and suggestions for discussion topics at thepublichealthinsight@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.